Welcome to Deep 404. Let's just start with a video just demonstrating the power of a Russian fab bomb. Just have a quick look at this and then we'll get into, watch the tower, that one. And then we'll get into talking a little bit about some propaganda and other economic nonsense coming out of the West. That's one, I believe, and maybe a second strike has happened. The film was held there for a moment, but the first one's taken out the first tower. This is at the Kurakhove thermal power plant, where Ukrainian forces are reportedly retreating to here. So they're retreating here because it's a big industrial complex. It's very strong and fortified. And yet they're coming already under attack from that sort of firepower, those fab bombs. Look, I wanted to just talk a little bit about, the propaganda is getting pretty heavy at the moment. And there's just a couple of bits and pieces here that you might want to have a look at, or you might not have seen. So earlier this week we had the Storm Shadow strike in the area of Kursk. Apparently 12 Storm Shadow missiles were launched by the Ukrainians with the help of the British, possibly Americans, in terms of providing satellite information, targeting information. And this is the information which is starting to come out of pro-Ukrainian channels now. Here we go. More than 500 North Korean troops killed in the Storm Shadow missile strike in the Kursk region. 18 Russian officers. General Sodolchuk, where's General Sodolchuk? Here, Ukrainian Storm Shadow missile kills a Russian army general. This is coming from globaldefensecorp.com. I haven't investigated them, but they've got an interesting looking website. And this is, these people were killed, 18 Russian officers were killed, 33 soldiers, Russian soldiers killed, 500 Korean soldiers, and this is the consequences of the Storm Shadow attack on Marino in Kerchnya. Now, as you may well know, apart from Ukrainian sources in reporting that there are North Korean troops in Russia, there are no North Korean troops in Russia. There are none that have been reported. That makes no good sense why they would be there fighting on the front line. While there may be some North Korean observers there, military officials watching what's going on, learning, taking some of the learnings from the Russian armed forces back to North Korea. And there is the one North Korean, which I showed in yesterday's video. If you haven't seen it at the end of this video, it'll be displayed up here or here somewhere for you to click on and go and have a look. It's very short, but you might get a giggle out of it. But I proved the North Koreans are in Russia. Anyhow, so this is going on. We've also got Biden really writhing around in his last couple of months in the presidency, authorising the long-range missile strikes, which we saw led to the Oreshnik hypersonic missile strike by Russia on Dnipro, on the large missile production factory there. Biden has also just this week changed their policy on landmines, and again, this is a good read. I want to read you some of this. The reasoning is as sound as ever, not because Ukraine is being pushed backwards in Kupiansk region, in Kursk, in the Donbass, and should be mining their retreat routes so as to slow down the Russians as they advance. No. The Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, has given this reasoning. He told reporters on Wednesday that the decision was motivated by Russia's changing tactics on the front lines. And this is Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. Because the Russians have been so unsuccessful in the way they have been fighting, they've kind of changed their tactics a bit, Austin told reporters while in Laos. They don't lead with their mechanised forces anymore. They lead with dismounted forces who are able to close and do things to kind of pave a way for mechanised forces. And so the Ukraine needs America's help with these landmines to try and slow down that effort. The US expects Ukraine to use these anti-personnel mines to bolster defensive lines. Well, here we go. Now they're saying to tell the truth, with sovereign Ukrainian territory, not as an offensive capability in Russia. The US has also sought assurances that Ukraine will try to limit the risk to civilians from the mines. So this is just nonsense coming out of the Secretary of Defence. The Ukrainians are being pushed back on the front line everywhere, and they should, by rights, be mining those retreat routes so that any Russians trying to follow them are slowed down by landmines and anti-personnel mines. And that's why the Americans are sending them here, because they want to help Zelensky with his plans to retain some of the Kursk area that has been captured by the Ukrainians. Lloyd Austin saying that's because the Russians have become so unsuccessful with advancing with their mechanised forces that they're now doing this is, again, just nonsense. The Ukrainian Telegram channel, Resident, which is a really good source for inside Ukrainian information, is reporting that President Zelensky considers retaining the land in Kursk as the most vital goal that the army has at the moment, as it will provide Ukraine with a bargaining chip. Zelensky here, it's reported, believes that Putin's plan is to have reclaimed all of Kursk by the 20th of January. That date sounds familiar because that will be President Trump's inauguration. So here, this again, seeming to give a reason now to the whole Kursk adventure, being that if they could hold some Russian territory, it could be used as a bargaining chip when negotiations happen. As we see here now, there is a very good chance that all of that bargaining chip will be gone by the 20th of January, so there will be nothing to bargain with President Trump anyhow. It will be interesting to see if before January the 20th, we see the Ukrainians embark on something similar somewhere else, a land grab somewhere along the Russian line to try to rapidly take some land, which they won't be able to hold for very long, like Kursk, but which would look to perhaps give them some sort of a bargaining chip. This won't work as a bargaining chip with President Putin because, quite simply, he has stated that all of that land needs to be returned to Russia and will be returned to Russia before the negotiations actually happen. It's one of those prerequisites. So if Ukraine does take some land, it may delay the start of negotiations, but those won't start until those Ukrainians have been pushed off the Russian territory. So any such move, another Kursk 2, announced by Zelensky, would just be a terrible means of seeing more Ukrainian men killed for a pointless goal. This Resident channel also stating that while President Zelensky's office is unable to find resources to produce missiles, you may have seen there's been a lot of talk about how Ukraine is going to be producing its own missiles and it'll become capable to fire back and won't even need long-range missiles. Again, this is unlikely to happen, as we've seen with the first hypersonic Oreshnik strike that was on a missile production factory in Dnipro. Any sort of development of manufacturing for missiles will be identified as soon as possible by the Russians and will become targets, as the Russians won't allow the Ukrainians to produce missiles to be employed upon deeper in Russia. So they say while Zelensky is struggling to find resources to produce missiles, Russia is actively rebuilding the economy on a war footing and increasing the military budget for 2025, which once again proves Putin's plans to achieve his goals in Ukraine by military means. Well, that may or may not be the case. I think he'd happily negotiate his goals, but if forced into achieving them via military means, then so be it, I think. This actually, on this point here, so this is coming from internal Ukrainian reporting. They have a source within the presidential office. And so they are saying that Ukraine is struggling to produce missiles and that Russia is actively rebuilding its economy on a war footing, increasing its budget. It amazes me that so many still of the NATO pro-Ukrainian crowd disregard this position, which is coming from the Ukrainian government itself, and instead claim the Russian economy is collapsing. I see a lot of confused people online showing graphs of the ruble against the dollar and claiming this means that the Russian economy is crashing. What these people are failing to grasp is that Russia is reducing its trade in US dollars. So comparison against a currency which Russia is using less and less each day and is making large steps to move away from in the future is not a reflection of the Russian economy. Remember that Russia is one of the world's resource-rich nations, so it doesn't need to import many resources. So it doesn't need to be spending a lot on importing resources. So it doesn't need to be buying a lot of US dollars to import resources. Also, it doesn't need to be buying a lot of US dollars because where it is importing resources through BRICS countries, through countries like China and India and Brazil and that, it's doing that in those native currencies now, not in US dollars. The manufactured goods that it does, or that it did buy from the West prior to 2022, those manufactured goods, it now gets through its BRICS allies, through China and India, or it produces them domestically. The sanctions that were placed upon Russia have forced Russians to withdraw money from the West, from banks in the West, bring them back to Russia and invest them domestically. And so they're being invested in the manufacturing, production of goods and services within the Russian economy. The domestic economy is surging, and it's due to those sanctions. An example is the announcement this week that the Russian Yakovlev MC-21 and Sukhoi Superjet 100, the SJ-100, these are commercial airliner planes. These planes have now become totally domestically produced. They have no reliance on US, Boeing or French, Airbus for engines or components. The first flights of these domestically replaced airliners are planned for 2025. The planes are already flying, but at this stage, they've still got existing US engines in them, I believe. But now in 2025, they will swap them out and start using domestically produced engines. And so while this itself is an achievement, which makes Russia, I think, only the second nation that entirely domestically produces their own commercial airliners. US being the other with Boeing. I think Airbus buys some components off Boeing, so I don't think France does. But Russia will now produce domestically everything for their commercial airlines. But they've done this during a war, while Russia is fighting a war. Also, on September the 7th this year, Moscow opened its 16th metro line. Now, metro lines are big infrastructure projects that take a lot of investment. Faltering economies don't invest in those sort of things. Russia has a massive labour shortage, and this is the biggest problem that Russia faces. As more and more people become fully employed in the military, so either directly, actively in the military, or by working and producing for arms of the military, then there are less people for private enterprise. And so this is the pressure which is on the economy at the moment. But it's not a problem for the economy because the economy is collapsing and failing. It's a problem because the economy is trying to grow and it is hitting limits with labour. But Russia will address this, though, by importing labour from BRICS nations. And while this sounds like a problem, this is actually a sign of the activity and strength of the Russian economy. And you've got to remember that Russia has 147 million people that it can draw upon. So there's a lot of people out there in that country who can work. And just on this point of the well, it's on the 2 points I've been talking about. The propaganda coming out of the West, the nonsense, things like Lloyd Austin saying that the reason they're supplying landmines to Ukraine is because Russia has been so unsuccessful with its advances. But this one talks about that propaganda and also the nonsense about the economy. So let me just read a little bit of this. This is from the Foreign Policy website. It's just a couple of paragraphs, but I want to read this to you. From Foreign Policy. The apparent resilience of the Russian economy has confounded many strategists who expected Western sanctions to paralyse Moscow's war effort against Ukraine. Russia continues to export vast quantities of oil, gas and other commodities, the result of sanctions evasion and loopholes deliberately designed by Western policymakers to keep Russian resources on world markets. So far, clever macroeconomic management, particularly by Russian Central Bank Governor Elvira Nabiullina, has enabled the Kremlin to keep the Russian financial system in relative health. They just can't admit that anything is going well here. At first glance, the numbers look surprisingly strong. In 2023, GDP grew by 3.6% and is expected to rise by 3.9% in 2024. Unemployment has fallen from around 4.4% before the war to 2.4% in September, hence the labour shortage. Moscow has expanded its armed forces and defence production, adding more than 500,000 workers to the defence industry. Approximately 180,000 added to the armed forces, and many thousands more to paramilitary and private military organisations. Russia has reportedly tripled its production of artillery shells to 3 million per year and is manufacturing glide bombs and drones at scale. The glide bombs, one of those fabs we saw what those things can do at the start of the show. But despite these accomplishments, Russia's war economy is heading towards an impasse. Signs that the official data mask severe economic strains brought on by both war and sanctions have become increasingly apparent. No matter how many workers it tries to shift to the defence industry, the Kremlin cannot expand production fast enough to replace weapons at the rate they're being lost on the battlefield. Already, around half of all artillery shells used by Russia and Ukraine are from North Korean stocks. At some point in the second half of 2025, Russia will face severe shortages in several categories of weapons. Perhaps foremost amongst Russia's arms bottlenecks is its inability to replace large caliber cannons. According to open source researchers using video documentation, Russia has been losing more than 100 tanks and roughly 220 artillery pieces per month on average. Producing tank and artillery barrels requires rotary forges, massive pieces of engineering weighing 20 to 30 tonnes each, that they can each produce only about 10 barrels a month. Russia only possesses 2 such forges. Okay, this last paragraph is great, and there's a couple of things I want to talk about here, because if you go to Foreign Policy and look at this article, they do have some links here to some of these things. So, for example, they say around half of all artillery shells are coming from North Korean stocks. When you go and read those articles and you go and look to find out what the sources are, the source is South Korea saying that North Korea has shipped something like 20,000 containers to Russia in the last year. It doesn't know what's in those containers. It openly admits they could be 152mm shells, they could be 122mm shells, they could be other things, they could be other stocks, they don't know. But if they were all 155mm shells, you could fit in 9 million of them there. And so that's where this number comes from. So this isn't a real number. This is fiction and speculation that half of the Russian shells are coming from North Korea. At some point, they go on to say, in the second half of 2025, they'll face severe shortages, more shortages of weapons, and most of these being the ability to replace large caliber cannons. According to open source researchers, again, when you go and look at their open source researchers, some of these are already discredited and have been for a long time. Many of the pieces of hardware that are claimed to be Russian tanks and armoured personnel carriers and this sort of thing, and artillery pieces, are Soviet equipment, yes, but Soviet equipment that was employed by Ukraine. So many of the pieces which should have been counted on the Ukrainian side as being destroyed have been counted on the Russian side. Also here, they're saying that Russia only possesses 2 of these forges. How does the West know, after the last couple of years, how many of these the Russians have? They are produced, they generally produce, the biggest producer of them is an Austrian factory. So sure, they know the Austrians have sold them none. That doesn't mean that the Russians haven't built any. As we've just heard, they have had, probably 1 million people employed, 500,000 workers to the defence industry. Some of these people are probably building these forges if it's what they need. Plus, the Russians have large stockpiles of older tanks and things like that, which they can replace these barrels on. And as always, when the West brings up these points that, Russia must be suffering because they're running out of barrels because they're firing shells, you have to then reflect that back onto the Ukrainian forces. Okay, are they firing shells? They are. Are they wearing their barrels out? They are. Are they being replaced in large numbers from the West? They are not. So often any of these problems which the West is suggesting the Russians might be having are really a projection of a problem that Ukraine is having in the conflict. Also, another problem here is the mobilization. Reportedly, again from internal Ukrainian Telegram channels, that only 25 to 30% of the Ukrainian government's targeted quota for mobilization is being achieved. So they can't find the ability to produce missiles, they can't find men to fight. There is talks that the government in Ukraine is talking about a demobilization bill and has been doing for 8 months or more, trying to give hope and aid the morale of the men who are fighting, because the men who are fighting aren't demobilized. They're not rolling out of the fighting. They're staying there, or they're dying, or they're continuing to fight. The government has already had 8 months to draw up this demobilisation bill to define how it would work and how people would be demobilised. There is a target date of December the 18th when it needs to be submitted. However, MP Ian Fritz expressed doubt that clear deadlines for demobilisation would be set by the December 18th target. Also, the head of the communications department of the 48th OAB, Bohdan Petronko, also said that total demobilisation of the military should not be expected in the near future, but did note that many soldiers continue to hope for word of demobilisation. So, just to summarise, Russia is continuing to demonstrate overwhelming force superiority in the battle with the use of FAB, these glide bombs, TOS flamethrower systems, and now the Oreshnik missile, and of course the overwhelming air superiority that they have, and missile superiority with almost daily missile and drone attacks on the military and energy production infrastructure of Ukraine. Ukraine is struggling to find men to fight, and morale is falling as Russia is pushing Ukraine out of Kursk, out of the Kupiansk area, and out of the Donbass. And Ukrainian propaganda is in full flight, with claims of Russia running out of shells and barrels again, and 500 North Koreans and Russian generals killed in the Kursk Storm Shadow strike, and yet there is no evidence of Koreans fighting in Ukraine, or except, as I said before, in this video, which is probably going to be up here or here somewhere very soon. Go and have a look at it, you might get a laugh. All right, I'll talk to you soon.